welcome to our afternoon session, as more people will be coming in. If you mind, if I may just add a few more words of introduction to our special guests. Much has been said during our worship service and last night. I feel a close connection with the Diegos because my son, Andrew, is part of their little fellowship in Tennessee, in Chattanooga. So I asked Andrew, what can you tell me about the Diegos, about the Silvas? And he says, on Friday nights, we've been recently going through a series about navigating friendships and relationships. From what I heard earlier, that he would tell us, there's about 15, 20, 25 sometimes that meet at your home. Pastor Diego and Melissa have lunch in their home for the first Sabbath each month. And all of these young kids, I don't call them young anymore, young adults, who are singles and probably married, I'm not sure, they all rush to their home on the first Sabbath of each month for a meal. Not just that, but on Friday evenings, there was no other place to go to but to their home. So they really appreciate your ministry. And it kind of reminds me, having grown up in India on a campus. I grew up on a campus, our church campus. On Friday evenings, we met at the home of our missionary couple from Australia. It started out with 10, 15, ended up with 45, 50 of them. See, so my son is kind of carrying on that tradition, I guess. It's a wholesome experience when somebody as caring as the Silvas are for the well-being of our young adults, their relationships, their well-being, their outlook, and their Christianity, that you would take the effort to cater for their needs. So I really want to, on a personal level, appreciate what you've been doing for them. I'm not sure how many of you have been here last night and all through this morning. For me, there were a couple of takeaways. Last night, I liked the idea of how God wants to take us back to Genesis 1 experience.
Now, some of you are married to somebody from the same country, same part of the country. You both speak the same language. So you may say, well, communication is easy, but you know it's not, even if you, what's that? It's not. So Melissa and I, we both speak English, and we both studied theology, and we're both Seventh-day Adventists, and we both have similar life goals. So we thought communication is going to be easy. So I want to start by talking about what we refer to as high context communication and low context communication. I'm going to explain what that means. In high context communication, you have few barriers to overcome in order to communicate your thoughts to somebody. In high context communication, you have very few barriers. So for example, my son and daughter, Caleb and Abigail, between the two of them, there is high context communication because they both speak English. Not only that, they were both born in the same place. They've both been raised in the same home. So that increases the possibility of good communication. So when he says something to her, there's more of a chance that she's going to understand what he's saying because there are fewer barriers. They've been raised in the same church. They've been raised by the same parents. They both speak the same language. In low context communication, you have many barriers to overcome in order to communicate your ideas. So for example, you take me and you put me in Korea, in a community where...
Not as in being upset at each other, but that's just one of their ways. The English language tends to be very logical. So they like to reason through things logically, and the Germans have a way of, they argue back and forth, this kind of culturally a way of communicating. And I had this class, and then I met a woman who had been married to a German man.
She was American.
She was American.
She was Brazilian.
No, she's American. She
Oh,
learned
yeah.
Portuguese.
She was American.
She was
that learned
American, and she's like, it just didn't work out. He was always arguing with me. He was just always arguing. And later I thought, you know, and she's like, he was a good man. You know, he wanted what was best, but it just always seemed like he was arguing with me all the time. And I remember thinking, he was just communicating as a German, and she didn't understand that that's how he communicated, and that created a gap that became a wound that, you know, ended their marriage. But like, he never committed adultery. He treated her generally well. He took good care of the family, but there was this low context communication. But they both spoke English because he spent many years in the United States, and so she didn't dawn on her that his way of speaking English was culturally different than her way.
Yep. And so Melissa and I, we discovered early on, and we're still discovering and still working through this because it's a work in progress. We've been married 18 years. We don't sit up here and talk as if we were an authority or that if we had arrived at some type of perfection in our marriage. We've discovered that it is an ongoing process of learning how to communicate, and not only that, understanding how to step into the mind of the other person to understand where they're coming from and appreciate those differences.
But these tools have been so helpful for us in navigating our differences and overcoming our conflicts that we have a burden to share the tools with others.
Yeah, so we're going to make a list together for just a moment. A list of differences, okay? A list of differences that exist in a couple, between two people in a marriage, that can increase the potential for miscommunication. So let's just go through it. There's some obvious ones. If you were here earlier this morning, I really focused on one in particular, but there are many that we can list. So let's go. I want to hear from you. Just say it out loud, and I'll repeat it. So what are some differences amongst couples
That can create communication gaps.
Yes. Anybody?
Native language.
Language is an obvious one. Not always the case, right? So not every couple has to overcome that. There are many couples who English is their native language or Spanish is their native language. But for some of you, you are having to communicate with your spouse in your second language. So that's one, language. What else? Intonation, interesting, okay. We're going to put that under the category of speech. So let's keep that under language, speech. What else? What's that? Okay, what will we put that under? Food, culture.
Culture.
So we're gonna put culture. We're gonna say culture. Culture is huge, and under culture there are a number of things. Food being one of them. What's that?
Family.
Family. That's so. Language, culture, family. So I mentioned this morning, in my family, I mentioned this last night, not this morning. In my family culture, which is a subculture of my larger Brazilian culture, in my family growing up, we don't eat at the table. We eat on the couch in front of a television. In Melissa's family, they eat at a table, sitting together, having conversation. So we come from two different family backgrounds.
And it's important. So like off the bat, it's okay, well, you know, so you like to eat in front of television and you don't. But what kind of conflict does that make? But like when we got married, so he doesn't talk when he eats. Like he never had to ever talk and eat at the same time. And so we're married and we're sitting and I'm talking and talking. He's like, can you be quiet a little bit?
Well,
like,
well, in the beginning, what happened was my quietness was interpreted by her as if I was upset. So it wasn't, I don't know if I actually ever said, please be quiet.
well, later on when the kids came around, we'd be having lots of
Well,
conversation. I'd be
once
asking the
the
kids
kids-
how the day was, and he's like, can we just be quiet a little
Once
bit
the
around the
kids
table?
came around, it just felt like it was noisy and there wasn't peace, you know, because there's everybody talking. But in the beginning, when Melissa and I just first got married, what really created some communication conflict or some communication gaps was my silence was interpreted as he must be upset. Why isn't he talking? Because I do talk. And when we're in the car, we talk. When we dated, we would go on road trips.
You had lots to say when we were dating.
Lots to say. And so I come home for lunch, and I'm eating, and there's no conversation happening. And so what's wrong with him? Well, for me, I was just in my thoughts, and, you know, I just
never had the habit of talking and eating.
So the family background difference creates the potential for low context communication.
And
So
that can, it seems simple, but it's like the proverbial squeezing the toothpaste from the end or not. There are little things that, if left unaddressed, become irritants that can cause bigger problems. And so, just like an alcoholic will never make improvements until he acknowledges that he's alcoholic, when we start acknowledging and talking through what are our differences, then they're not going to be as much of a, forgot the word now. Speaking of.
So we're making a list of, we're going to make a list. We've got 3: language, culture, and
Family.
age.
Age, very
Great.
good.
In my church, or I'll say that I've pastored 8 churches now. 8 churches. For me, as a pastor, believe it or not, in the churches I've pastored, the biggest cultural communication gaps have been created by age. Boomers and millennials. And it's not so much that they speak different languages. They speak English, but there are differences, big differences in the generations, and that creates the potential for miscommunication. You may or may not, if you're a grandparent or even a parent of a teenager, you may be experiencing this right now, where there is a lot of misunderstanding between you and the kids. I'm looking at the congregation. Most of you are parents or grandparents. If there were some teenagers here, maybe you're having trouble communicating or understanding your parents or your grandparents. So age is a huge factor in communication gaps.
So if you marry someone that's from a different, like 10 or 20 years difference from you, that's a difference in the way you communicate.
And it can be a potential for conflict. Yes?
I have a question. You know, you talk about the communication gap because of language or culture or age, but all this can be a big problem if you don't have a love relationship. Because when you have love for the other person, all the other things are just peripheral. Because when you don't care about the other person, when you don't love the other person, then all these things, the cultural difference, age difference,
Yeah.
language difference, all become big issues.
Yeah.
But for a relationship, in my opinion, all those things are just peripheral.
Yes.
The important thing is to love and care
Yes.
for the other person.
Yeah, if you read 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, love is the solution, right? And that would be, it would be really a short seminar if I just said love. It solves it all. What we're going to do here is we're going to try to unpack what it looks like in the flesh, because, you know, in the spirit, it sounds great. In the flesh, it's kind of like learning to fly a plane. And I really believe that, you know, in our society, we put a lot of emphasis on education and training. When we talk about surgery or flying a plane or you name the skill, architecture, whatever it is, an X-ray technician, we require training, we require education. But when it comes to marriage, we just think that it's so simple. You just fall in love, you get married, and everything works itself out. Well, the statistics show that it's just not like that. Most marriages end in divorce, and most marriages that don't end in divorce, which are already the minority, are not thriving, they're just surviving. So people are not fulfilled. Love is the answer, and it's biblical. 1 Corinthians 13, Paul's dealing with a church in turmoil, divisions, and conflict. In 1 Corinthians 13, love does not seek its own good. So love is not selfish. And Paul unpacks it. Paul doesn't just say, love each other. He actually explains in their context. Because if you read 1 Corinthians 13, compare it to the rest of the letter, Paul is taking the principle of love and explaining to them what it looks like in their context. There's rivalry. So he says, love does not seek to always be right. So he's explaining, and that's what we're trying to do here.
And
Absolutely great point. Love is the solution for all of these communication gaps that exist between us.
And love is the motivating factor. So, for example, I went to Brazil and I learned to speak Portuguese, right? Because I want to love the people, I want to teach the people, so out of my desire to help, I'm going to learn the language so I can help them. And so in marriage, I love my husband, and because I love him, I want to learn to communicate better with him, and I want to learn to understand what he says so I can serve him better, and he wants to serve me better. And so
love bridges the communication gap. So if you look at Jesus, Jesus is love in the flesh. Jesus learned Aramaic because Aramaic was the language of the people that he was ministering to. So love bridges the communication gap. So that's why we need to unpack love, because you love your grandkids, and maybe your grandkids, they speak in slang that you don't understand, and you, rather than try to understand what they're saying, you condescend and you make fun of, or you criticize, you condemn, forgetting that when you were a teenager in the 60s or 70s, you started speaking slang in ways that your grandparents couldn't relate to. So love bridges communication gaps. Jesus did not expect humans to learn the language that he spoke. He learned Aramaic. Jesus dressed like a Galilean. He didn't expect the Galileans to dress in some heavenly garb. Jesus ate the Galilean food. So love bridges gaps in communication. So keep that in mind as we talk about this, because for me to love Melissa is not imposing my culture on her, it's also trying to understand her culture. And so that's important. Yes?
It's one thing you need to learn the love language of your partner.
Yes.
Because sometimes
That's part of it.
my father's love language to my mother was to give her gifts. She didn't want gifts.
Yeah.
She wanted his love.
Yeah.
I'm bringing you his love.
Yes. Absolutely. Let's keep making our list. We've mentioned...
Let's also start using the mic.
Okay, so when there's a hand, I'll call on you and then you'll wait on the mic. So we've talked about language, culture, age, and family. So we've got 4 areas that create communication gaps. Let's keep going. Let's build this list. Yes? Religion. That's definitely on the list. It's an obvious one. If a Baptist walks in here and we say there's potluck, they understand potluck. But if we say we're having haystacks for potluck, guess what? We have low context communication. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because a Baptist understands potluck, but they do not understand haystack. And so that's just on the language end of religion, but then there's also thinking patterns within each religion.
And
then
habits.
even within Christianity, you have you have denominations, subcategories like Seventh-day Adventism, and even within Seventh-day Adventism, we have a large spectrum, don't we? And so, religion is definitely an area that can create low context communication. Yes.
What about false expectations?
False expectations is going to be related to all of these. Melissa had expectations about walks based on her family upbringing. I had expectations about what a walk means based on my family upbringing. So we're all going to have expectations based on our culture, our family, our age, etc. So that's going to permeate every single one. But let's keep going. There's more. What? Personality. Is that what you're going to say? Okay. Oh, okay.
History.
History. Yeah. What's that? Education. Yes.
There's a hand back there.
Somebody said education. So think about a young man who is a farmer marrying a woman who has a PhD in some
Biochemistry.
biochemistry. Is it wrong for a young farmer to marry a doctor in biochemistry? Is it wrong? Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, based on what I shared this morning, it will actually potentially enrich that couple, because he's going to bring something and she's going to bring something, and together it'll be rich. But does it create the potential for communication gaps? Yes. So education. So we've mentioned, I'm going to review, language, culture, age, family, personality, education. What else? Socioeconomic status. Melissa and I, on this one, very, very much alike. We both grew up poor. Poor,
Low
middle class French Canada, low middle class Brazil. Different, but still we understood what it was like to live on scarcity and a tight budget, and not being able to do things that our friends were able to do. And so, but is there a potential for conflict and communication issues if a young person who grows up in a very affluent home marries someone who grows up in a very poor home? Absolutely. Is it wrong for them to get married? No. We're not saying that these are differences that make them unequally yoked.
I mean, religion aside.
We're saying these are differences that create low context communication. All it means is it's going to be harder. But everything that is harder is all the better. You know, everything that's hard in life, well, let's say everything that's good in life comes with a price, right? So there's a few more that we can add to this list that can create communication gap. Yes?
Logical versus emotional thinking.
Logical versus emotional thinking.
I put that, we can add that as a separate item, but I put that under personality. But that could be a separate,
Yeah.
yeah. Any, political, politics, absolutely. So, a Democrat marrying a Republican. Two different ways of seeing the world. Two different ways of seeing the country. Can they be married? Yeah. It's going to require a lot of emotional intelligence in order for those two to have unity. Yes?
Let's go back to what you said about the biochemist and the farmer. It depends on the attitude. Because if you, in some instances, it doesn't work. For the simple fact that they're going to say, what do I have in common with this individual? This individual has a degree in bioscience. Well, biochemistry. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
and the other is farmer. They're going to say, wait, where is the communication at? I'm talking about growing wheat. The person is talking about
Yeah.
surgery or whatever has to do with science.
Yeah.
So sometimes it doesn't work, but it depends on your relationship with the Lord.
Yep.
That's how it can work.
Yep. Thank you so much. I mean, that's going back to the comment about love, right? Love is the factor that will determine whether this is going to work. The love bridges the communication gaps. And go ahead.
But you know, love does not mean that you're not going to be your own individual.
That's right.
Okay?
That's right.
Still going to have
Yes.
different
Yeah.
personalities.
Yes.
Like, for example, going back to what you said about your wife was used to talking at the table eating. You weren't. Sometimes I don't like to talk when I'm at the table eating. But that doesn't mean I don't love my wife.
That's right.
It means the fact that I want to concentrate on my food. I've been out in the workforce all day. I've been out in the workforce all day. And I'm always interested in what my wife has done at work and so on and so forth. But when that good food is in front of me,
You're my kind of guy.
I'm saying to myself, look, we can spare the talk a little bit and let's go ahead and eat.
Yes.
So
That's
what I'm saying.
you know,
So here's where love gets action, at least like in our marriage. There are days when we'll be quiet and we'll eat quietly. And there are days when we're going to talk and we're going to meet each other. It's not going to be just about what he likes or just about what I like.
Yeah.
But what if I say, in love, I'm just going to let him always be quiet because I love him and let him be him, and then I suppress myself. So because I love him, eventually that suppressing becomes unhealthy. And one of these days you're like, I love you, but I can't take this anymore.
But it depends upon what type of work he's doing too. Because you don't know. Let's be realistic.
Yes.
Okay, he's a pastor.
Yeah.
Okay, he's dealing with people in the church 24 hours,
Yes.
7 days a week, listening to things that he cannot divulge to you, but sometimes he has to pray to the Lord. And that can be wearisome on the mind as well. So sometimes, you know, you have to understand your partner as well.
Yes.
Of what type of occupation that person is in, and understand, you know, probably he doesn't, or he or she doesn't feel like talking right now, because just like a nurse dealing with patients every day. They're dealing with sick people every day. You know what I mean? And sometimes they're on their feet every day, all through. And sometimes in the nursing field, you don't have a set time for which you should leave. You understand what I mean? So when you're coming home, the first thing you're saying is, Lord, thank God I'm home. I'm tired. I want to eat, so on and so forth. And sometimes it's not because you don't love the individual. It's because sometimes you need some time to yourself as well.
Yeah.
But let's say, for example, and this was our case earlier in our marriage, so he's got that heavy load. But I'm home alone all day with 2 babies. I got no family because we're pastoring out in the boonies, and I can't talk to the church members because they're church members, and I can't open up, and I have no family, and I'm alone with babies all day long. And he comes home, he doesn't want to talk, but well, guess what? I need to talk. And he needs to be quiet. And so we both have needs, you know.
and sometimes those needs,
That is realistic.
yeah.
Right.
Sometimes,
It depends on the culture of the individual and the family too. Not everybody wants to hear a lot of talk, especially when they were dealing with outside
Yeah.
stress,
Yeah.
outside situations that sometimes can be unbearable. And when they're coming home, which is their refuge, they're saying, you know, I want to talk to my wife, but I need time to just unload
Yeah.
sometimes.
yeah.
And it's
So this illustrates often 2 people that love each other, are committed to each other. They both have real needs, and sometimes those needs intersect with each other in a way that really creates this need either for compromise or for conflict that becomes unhealthy. There's one more difference. So we've listed 9 things, and the most obvious one between a man and a woman that we didn't mention. Gender. Think about that. Gender. So you can be from the South. You can be American. You can be English speaking. You can be from the same denomination, same political affiliation. You can grow up in the same small town, somewhere in Mississippi. You can come from a similar cultural background, but you're still male and female. Male and female, if biblically, though we believe in equality, we don't believe in sameness. In other words, and this is just, observable, men and women are different. They're wired differently. So no matter how much of a culture, educational age gap you may or may not have, you still have to overcome the gender gap. And we don't pay enough attention, and we got to talk about it, in church. And, a lot of times, and this is generalizing, going back to the point that was being made about quietness at the table versus talking, men in general like to just retreat to the cave when there's conflict or when they're overwhelmed. This is not every man, right? But this is general, and I fall in this category. When I'm overwhelmed, I'm reclusive. I go to a cave, not a literal cave. If you have a basement, maybe you go to a basement. Some of you men have a place in your house where you just,
The man cave.
the man cave, as we call it. In general, yes, the refuge. Solomon in Proverbs says sometimes it's the roof of the house. In general, women, when they're overwhelmed, they need to talk about it. It's a gender difference, and it's not always the case. So sometimes we have to be careful when we talk about gender differences because there are exceptions to the rule. But that can, be a potential, if you don't understand how the other is wired, it can be a potential for problems. Because when I go quiet, it can communicate that I am upset with her, that I'm being cold towards her. Or when she's too expressive about how she feels, overwhelmed, I can take that as an attack. Like you're attacking me because maybe I'm the problem with why you're overwhelmed. You see that? And so I'll give you another example in our marriage. I would say this one here is probably going to fall more in the area of personality difference, but it potentially could be also gender. But when I'm sick, I want to be left alone. I don't want to go to the doctor. I don't want to be nursed. I have to be really, really bad. I have to be really, really bad for me to want my wife there putting a cold compress on my head. I have to be really bad for me to say, honey, please get me some water because I can't get up to go get my own water. You know what I'm saying? That's me. Melissa, when she's sick, she wants what she would do if she saw one of her sisters in bed sick. And Melissa's the kind of person, if her sister is sick, Melissa is going to be the best nurse you'll ever find. She's going to be taking care of all the details, cooking all the right foods that they need, making sure they have water, cold compress, the whole thing. So this is love language. Melissa is going to do for me when I'm sick what for her is assumed the right thing to do based on what she would want if she was in that position. And same here. So the first time she got sick after we got married, guess what? I was treating her I was following Matthew 7:12, the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I made sure she was not dying, obviously, right? I mean, I'm not going to let her die. But, you know, I just giving her space. And guess how she interpreted that? That did not go over well. And then when I would get sick, you know, just a cold, whatever, and I'm usually good at getting over stuff quickly. I don't need medication. You'll have a fever one day, sweat it out that night, the next day I'm back at work.
He's got
But
an
then-
autoimmune disease. He's got a really great immunity.
But then 10 years into our marriage, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And for 2 years, I was in bad shape. And then I learned the benefit of having a good nurse at home. And going through that experience was important for me to understand, first of all, to appreciate the difference. Because I couldn't afford to just be left alone. Yeah, so...
But this illustrates the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is not do to others what you want. It's find out what they would like and do
Yes,
that for
yeah,
them.
yeah.
And so this talk
That's
about
right.
communication is learning how to do unto your spouse as they would appreciate you doing.
That's right, yeah. So let me explain another difference. Now we've listed 10 things, okay? I don't know if you might have already forgotten. I can give them to you later. But we have 10 areas that create these communication gaps: gender, education, culture, language. We made a list of 10 things. So these are all differences. So let me give you an example of some differences between Melissa and me, and tell me where you think this falls. I am an optimist. She is a realist. Now, I would call it a pessimist, but
No,
we've
it's-
refined that to realism, okay? And I can tell you many stories that illustrate this. You want to tell one? Do you have one in mind?
Of your optimism?
Yes.
Sure.
Are you thinking of one now, or you want me to tell?
I haven't always asserted myself in our marriage.
Go ahead.
And so just take in this itinerary that my husband lovingly planned for us. Of course, we had planned this to be 8 weeks after my son was born, but he was 2 weeks overdue. So 6 weeks after my son was born, he's 6 weeks old, okay? We fly to Brazil without my husband because he went ahead. He got a teenage girl to fly down with me. Abigail was 2, and Caleb was 6 weeks old. Fly to Brazil for ministry. Spend a week in Brazil. Come back from Brazil, overnight flight with 2 babies. Land in the United States. Next day, drive up to Canada to see my parents. Spend 3 days with my parents. My son is now 7 weeks old, okay? Big baby, postpartum here, girlfriends. Drive back home to Virginia. It was a 14-hour drive to Canada, okay? 14-hour drive up to Canada the day after we got back from Brazil. Drive back to the United States, arrive on Thursday. Sunday morning, we're moving to Montana.
She's leaving out a lot of details.
Sunday morning, we're moving to Montana. We arrive back on Thursday, camp meeting, in the middle of camp meeting on campus, to finish packing the house while he has speaking engagements. We have a 2-year-old and a newborn, and we're packing up the entire house to leave first thing Sunday morning to move to Montana. That was his great.
And we arrive in Montana on Friday. I'm preaching the next day, and the whole family is with us on Sabbath morning, and Wednesday night, first prayer meeting, the whole family's together.
Yes, and so he's just he loves to use his time really wisely. That's what he likes to say.
Optimism. It's that optimism that says, we're
We
going to
can do
get
it.
to the airport 45 minutes before the flight is ready to depart, and we'll be at the gate within 5 minutes of...
And it's the optimism that once we got to Montana, I said, you're having a vasectomy, because that was hard to do with 2 kids.
Yes.
To be just real honest with you guys.
So Melissa, she is glass half empty, and I'm not saying that as a critique. This is actually a quality. Every marriage needs a realist. Every marriage needs somebody who is going to say, hey,
Boots on the ground.
have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Raising the questions. You know the story of the spies? You know, the Bible critiques the spies because they were pessimistic about the outlook, but that was in the context. God was very clear, this is what you're going to do, and I'm going to be with you. But the 10 spies were raising questions. They were looking at the reality, and we may put those people in a negative light based on that story, but the truth is that there are many times, Jesus tells the parable of the man who started building the tower, and he didn't count the cost. You remember that parable? And Jesus commends the idea of ask questions, calculate. So I'm the guy that is building the tower and didn't count the cost. Does that make sense? I got that Joshua and Caleb spirit. We can conquer the land, right? And she's got that spirit of the 10 spies. Hey, what about the giants? What about this? Well, the Bible will portray both in a positive or negative light, depending on the context. So when we talk about glass half empty, glass half full, it's actually an asset to our marriage to have both. Now, will that lead to conflict? Yes. It'll lead to conversations. And then later, so how does it work for Melissa and me? Conversations. So today we can talk about that whole experience and say, yeah, we needed to have done it differently. Now, does that mean that I have to admit that I'm wrong? Yes. Is it okay for a man to be wrong in the marriage? Is it a violation of what Paul says in Ephesians 5 for a man to sit down with his wife, listen to her, and say, hey, yeah, we needed to have done that differently. You were right. And so that's really, at the end of the day, going back to love. Love is interested in the truth, not in what's right or what's wrong. Now, Melissa's glass half empty approach would have kept us from buying a house when we moved from Montana to Kansas, which, looking back, we both agree would not have been a good thing, because now we would probably be out of the market. We have friends who had $100,000 in the bank. At the same time we moved to Kansas from Montana, had $100,000 in the bank. We had zero. We had no down payment. And they decided not to enter the market, not to risk it, Later, with the boom during pandemic, now they got maybe $130,000, $140,000 in the bank. They still can't buy a house, where they live. Because there's some parts of the country where $100,000 is not going to be a 20% down payment on a house anymore. Things just went crazy. So we look back, my glass half full approach, though, would have probably got us a house that we couldn't afford. We might have defaulted on the house. So we went, that difference of she's a realist, I'm an optimist, those differences will either drive us apart or it'll bring us together.
And we're hoping, so the reason we're going over all these differences kind of one by one is because we're hoping this is going to generate dialogue in your own homes where you can, it can be a really fun talk to have. Like, let's talk about what is our cultural difference? What is our family difference? Who is the realist? Who is the pessimist? How has it affected our marriage? What are ways? So we're going to talk a little, I think we're going to talk a little later about, being assertive. And I discovered, for example, in our marriage, that even though it's not something I had talked about, I grew up seeing my parents, and I kind of tended to be more like, well, just kind of with many things, just let him make the decision and don't be involved. Even though I wasn't always comfortable with some of the decisions that were being made. And then as the years went by, I realized, I need to make my voice heard too, and I need to learn to become more assertive in our marriage. Mm-hmm. And I need to learn to voice what I think in order to serve us better as a couple. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about that last night.
So looking at this particular difference between a realist and an optimist, where would we categorize that on the 10 that we talked about, the 10 areas that create the gap in communication? I'll tell you where I put it, personality. So Melissa and I, we may be of the same faith. We may have similar life goals. We may be very compatible in many areas. We're not unequally yoked, but we have different personalities. And those different personalities lead to often different approaches to certain situations. And so, for example, we have kids, and for the most part, we're in agreement on discipline and on education, but there have been differences. And so I often ask Abigail and Caleb, who's more strict, mommy or daddy? It's always interesting the answer I get. And so we're different, and that's okay. I believe those differences are an asset, not a liability, to us as a team parenting our kids. But here is one thing that we have to have as an agreement as a couple in the context of kids, that even if we may be different, we're never going to question one another in front of the kids. That's a huge no-no. Now, there may be times where I'm approaching the kids in a way different than she would, and we have to know who is at that moment the one that's going to lead out in. And it's simple things. It's just we're doing homework with the kids. Well, who's the one right now helping the kids with their homework? Is it mom or dad? Because when I help the kids with the homework, I have an approach that's different than Melissa's. The only thing we have in common is we both yell at them.
And guess what? When I'm gone, guess what they do during their meals? They watch television.
Good things, right?
Not all the time, but I'm
No.
generally there.
Yeah, she's exaggerating. The kids actually don't watch that much television, but if they do, it's probably going to be with Dad. I watched a lot more television growing up than Melissa did, but when we talk about television, we have to qualify what that means, and, because you can watch a lot of things. Abigail was watching Tiny Talks for Jesus when she was 2 or 3. It was always, we don't overdo it, but there are moments when it's a great tool to just give us a breathing break. Because when they're at a certain age, it requires a lot. But we have those differences, and we respect those differences. And I see it as an asset because, to be quite honest with you, Melissa reads with these kids a lot more than I do, and I'm so grateful for that. I read to the kids, she reads to the kids, but Melissa reads to them a whole lot more than I do. Melissa's a much better reader than I am. And those are differences, and I'm so grateful for them. And so when it comes to discipline, we have different approaches. And we may disagree, but I think the best way to interact in a healthy way with our spouse is to, as much as possible, see those differences as assets, not liabilities. Therefore, you don't despise the difference, you celebrate the difference. A healthy couple is going to learn to celebrate.
And that might take some stopping and thinking about it. There have been moments in our marriage when I started to despise certain quality in my husband. Something was irritating me. But then if I stop and think about all the qualities, and often that thing that irritates you can be the very thing that has quality.
Can you give an example? Let's talk about punctuality. You explained that well. In cultures where people tend to be less punctual, what is the quality that it takes time for someone that comes from a culture where being on time is a value, it's a high value?
So like in the Brazilian culture, they don't tend to be as punctual, but part of the reason is because they prioritize relationships. And my mother unfortunately died of Lou Gehrig's disease. And her last few years of life were very difficult. My father took care of her at home, and there were some Brazilians that didn't live so close. They lived like 45 minutes away, and they would come and bring food. They went out of their way to come and show love to my parents. And, especially when the kids were little, I was very much like, I wanted to be punctual. I wanted to have a schedule. I wanted to have the kids in bed every night at 7:30. And I wanted to have these, to be very, very regimented. And he's like, you know what, those Brazilians bringing food to your parents, you think they're that regimented? No, they have to have flexibility in their lives in order to serve others better. And that taught me to appreciate that more flexible side of the culture. And it's true, in Brazil, if you need somewhere to stay, you call, they're like, you come, and they can have the smallest house in the world and they will make room for you because they prioritize relationships. That's why arriving on time is not as important, because if I'm stopping to help someone on my way, it's more important to stop and help the person than to arrive punctually to my appointment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and we're generalizing here. There are Brazilians that are punctual, okay? So if you're a Brazilian and you're punctual, please understand we are generalizing. In general, especially the further north you go in Brazil, it's like this. To arrive 30 minutes late is to arrive on time to a birthday party. It's no big deal. It's not Switzerland. The further south you go, the more it feels like Germany or Switzerland in the sense that time matters. So we were in Kansas. There was a Brazilian Adventist family, and we were invited to a birthday party. They were from the north of Brazil, and it's their kids' birthday party, so we're taking our kids. The birthday party was scheduled for 4 p.m. Melissa wanted to be there at 3:50, because that's being on time, 10 minutes early. I said, let's go at 4:10, 4:15. I don't know, I think we arrived at 4. That was the
We were like 5 minutes past 4.
maybe 5 minutes past 4. We arrive, the mom is still in the shower. Nobody else is there yet. Nobody arrived till 5. And we were just hanging out in the living room. It was a little awkward because, it was advertised for 4, but in their mind, when they advertise for 4, they already know if they want people to be there at 5, then you advertise for 4 so that they will be there at 5. That is a cultural difference. Now, the aha moment, I think it was a breaking point, a breakthrough point, was understanding that component of the culture, though it may be irritating, it is irritating, because, say what you mean what you say, but it does have that element of a people who value relationships. And, not to say that every time a Brazilian is late, it's for a good reason, but it can be. So anyways, let's move on to the next portion of this. Let's talk about learning to be assertive. In every healthy marriage, there needs to be space for both spouses to be able to assert themselves. And being assertive does not mean being mean, rude, disrespectful, authoritarian. But in many marriages, and it's not always the case that it's the man that is dominant, in a lot of marriages it's the woman. When you have a dominant figure, it really creates a situation where one doesn't have space to share how they really feel and think. And that's not healthy. So do you want to share a story that illustrates how in marriage you have learned to be assertive?
I feel like I'm going to repeat the same story, but not everyone was here on Friday night. But
The car.
the cars.
Yeah, that's a good one, but
it's
give
kind
me
of
the detail.
It's kind of my key. When we moved to Montana, for some context, we had multiple engines blow on us, car engines blow. So now we moved to Montana. Diego had a 2-church district. We lived by one of the churches, and the other church was 120 miles away. So this is Montana. It's very cold in winter. And Diego's like, I can't risk another engine blowing on me in the dead of winter with babies. And these roads, there's no one on these roads. And so you can break down, and it can be a while sometime before you have. And so he felt like we should get a van so we could also serve the church better if we had a larger car, if we needed to give people rides, minister to people. Well, remember what I said about how he likes to use time very wisely. Well, we live 2 hours from Billings, which is where we would buy the car. And she's like, we're going to go in, we're going to buy the car, and then it's going to be all be done in one day because he doesn't want to go twice to Billings. I'm thinking, you know, the car is a bigger purchase. I don't know if I want to do it, you know, so quick. But I didn't say anything, and we went, and we end up with the van we wanted. We had another car which we couldn't quite afford. We turned in. It's a long story, stupid decisions. We got 2 new cars, or almost new cars.
2 brand new cars.
2 brand new cars on that one day to Billings. And after that, I had a hard time sleeping. I you know, talk about buyer's remorse. And so that stayed with me for a long time. And so then fast forward 2 years, and we were moving from Montana to Kansas, and Diego felt very strong that we should buy a house. And we were going to buy a house. You know, when you're pastoring, you don't live in the area. So you're flying into a town you've never been to in your life, and you're supposed to pick a house and buy it. Pick a neighborhood, pick a house. Like, it's not like when you know an area and you kind of know where to, you know, this is like, you have like 3 days to visit homes and buy a house. So I felt like that one day going to Billings and buying a car. And it was giving me like PTSD. And I said, no, I don't want to do it. And I think we should rent. We could get to know the area and then see about what's a house that we like. And so it created some conflict in our marriage because he felt very strongly we should buy a house. But then that's when I really felt like I shouldn't have been so quiet about the cars. I should have spoken up. I should have said how I felt about it, and I didn't. And so I'm not going to let that happen again. So I was pretty strong. I said, look, I really, really don't want to get a house. That's where we came to a compromise where I said, look, I really want to rent, but if you insist on buying, then it's got to be a 15-year mortgage, not a 30-year mortgage.
And when we look back at that story, we celebrate today the decision.
Yeah.
We made the best decision. Neither of us wanted what we ended up doing. Mm-hmm. She wanted to rent. I wanted to buy a nicer house on a 30-year mortgage, because you can afford more house on a 30-year mortgage. We knew what our budget for the house was. Well, on a 30-year mortgage, we could afford better house. And today we look back and we say, wow, that was the right decision. If we had rented, it would have been a terrible decision. If we had overbought, potentially a more disastrous decision. The decision we made was what neither of us wanted. We came to that decision because of healthy conflict. Healthy conflict is when you're in disagreement, but you're able to actually dialogue, brainstorm, go back and forth, compromise, give and take. And that illustrates what we talked about last night, partnership in marriage.
And also, if I hadn't spoken up, you know, my husband did it for the best of our family, right? He wasn't thinking of himself, he was thinking of us as a family. That doesn't mean it's a perfect decision, right? And I think I would have harbored resentment with him having made that decision, and that would not have been fair for him either, because he was making the decision for us. So when you shoulder the decision together, you make better decisions, but you also shoulder the consequences together. We did this together, but if one person's making a decision and it goes sour, it's harder. It takes, I mean, obviously with maturity, you can be like, you know, it was a bad decision, but we're going to go through it. But it has the potential to create also, to bring separation and bitterness into your marriage.
Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read 1 Corinthians chapter 12, a few passages. Paul here is talking about the church, not marriage, but I want you to understand that what he says here about the church applies to marriage. This is in the context of 1 Corinthians 13, where he talks about love. And his statements on love is in the context of a church in unhealthy conflict. And basically they are fighting with each other because of differences that they're not managing well in their relationship.
We got to remember that the home is the nucleus of the church. So if you're managing to have a home where these conflicts are not, you're going to be able to take that to church. And so they go hand
They
in
do
hand.
go hand in hand. And Paul goes back and forth. It's interchangeable. The principles that he refers to about healthy church dynamics are the same principles that apply
Exact
to
same
healthy
ones.
home dynamics. So 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we're just going to read a few verses. And Paul is celebrating the diversity. He's celebrating the diversity in the church. Diversity in the church is not a liability, it's an asset. Burnt Mills, this congregation is a multicultural church. That is not a liability, it's an asset. But it can become a liability if the differences are not navigated intelligently. So 1 Corinthians 12:12. For just as the body is one and has many members. Remember, in marriage, the analogy is two become one flesh, right? That's the analogy in marriage. When two become one flesh, does that mean that French Canadian and Brazilian becoming one, now they are a Brazilian family? That's the interpretation of some. You know, two becoming one flesh means now one has to swallow the other. Not necessarily. For Paul, two becoming one looks like this. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. So when we talk about the body, the human body, we don't talk about the bodies, we talk about the body. The body is made up of arms and legs and intestines and liver and ears and nose, but we talk about one body. And Paul says when all of these members come together and become one human body, you still have a nose and an ear and eyes. And the eyes don't cease to be eyes just because now they are part of a thing called a body. The same is true when two become one flesh. Brazilian, French Canadian now are one family, but they are still Brazilian and French Canadian. They didn't have to stop being what they are in order to now join this thing called the family unit. So Paul says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 14, indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. That's such an important statement because in a lot of churches I've pastored, I have had members who wanted to make the whole body like themselves. Whether it was politically or personality or theologically, I've pastored churches where the nose wanted the whole body to look like a nose. Imagine if every member of your body was a nose. Now, are we saying noses aren't important? No, noses are very important, but imagine if you had to walk on your nose. And I have seen churches who have had dominant members, and maybe the Burnt Mills Church has a dominant member. And I'll just tell you this, if it has one, you're not doing that person any favors by allowing them to be that way. And every church has individuals who want to be dominant. And it's actually not healthy. Paul says it's not healthy. Paul says the body does not consist of one member. You do not have a healthy body if you have ears that want to act like eyes. It's not healthy. So a body is healthy when each individual member is doing its part and it's a part of a team, and all together, working together, they are healthy. So Paul continues to say here in 1 Corinthians 12, I'm going to skip to verse 17. If the whole body were an eye, where would hearing be? If the whole body were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. So Paul's talking about the church. We apply this to marriage. So guess what? Melissa does not have to stop being French Canadian to be married to me. We can be one flesh, and I can still be Brazilian. And I can keep my personality. I don't have to become a risk-averse person to have a good relationship with Melissa. She doesn't have to become a risk taker to have a good relationship with me. So in Oregon, we discovered as a family whitewater rafting. Can you guess which one of the two enjoyed whitewater rafting more? The risk taker. So is it okay for us to even have hobbies that are different? Does she have to do all the things I like and I have to? No, she can still be who she is. She can look at me in the eye and say, you know what? I know you love whitewater rafting, but it's just not for me. And that's okay. My daughter had to do that. She looked at me and said, Daddy, I don't like whitewater rafting. Caleb, on the other hand, he kind of likes it. He just doesn't like the cold water, but he likes the excitement of it. Guess what? It's okay. Differences. We're going to end here with some questions, comments, about maybe 10, 15 minutes. I don't see anybody sleeping yet, but we're getting close. I can see we're getting close. I have a
We
hand
have
over
a
here.
microphone for the hand. I think it'll be better. It's over here. Who had their hand up?
Right here.
You know, I struggle a little bit with the idea of calling people out as pessimistic and, optimistic, because the pessimistic sounds negative,
Yes.
but the optimistic doesn't.
Yeah.
Positive versus negative, I think of a battery. And the battery has a negative terminal, which is more grounded than the positive. But the energy goes out on the positive side.
Ooh, that's a great analogy.
And the negative side of a couple is not negative, but in the realistic sense, it's the one that's counting the checks and balances and verbalizing them and thinking them through. And it needs to be, and a battery ceases to be a battery that's going to be a good battery working right if it's not grounded, because the grounded side receives the positive energy that has gone through.
That's a much better analogy.
You
I'm going
know,
to have to take that.
And it goes out, and of course you got to have a good alternator
Yeah.
and a good generator in there, but that electrical current has to be a solid. And if you have a ground or even a positive that's not strongly connected without any kind of corrosion, and if it's not, either cable is not good, you're not going to get a good start, and it's going to fail on you. But the negative side, being grounded, is even almost more important than the positive side.
That's a great analogy.
So I just wanted
Thank
to
you.
share that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. Anyone else have any thoughts, questions as we bring this to a close? We are done on our part, but we'd love to hear from you.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. I have a question. You kind of touched about the finances and stuff. So I've seen many married couples, they know that in today's society it's the 50-50 type thing because of, inflation and everything. But then you have some spouses who wind up taking most of the responsibility on everything, and the other spouse is left to worry about what needs to be done.
Yeah.
How would you handle that?
So we strongly believe, us two, we strongly believe that, first of all, couples should always share finances. There should never be his account, her account. He pays these bills, she pays those bills. They should be joint accounts. And budgets should be made together. The finances need to be reviewed together. And as far as who is the family treasurer, it's not a gender-based decision. The roles are determined not by gender, but by gifts. So in our marriage, depending on the season of our lives, sometimes Melissa has been the treasurer, sometimes I've been the treasurer, meaning the bookkeeper. But it doesn't mean that one is making a decision unilaterally, the other one's in the dark. That's never a recipe for a healthy marriage. I know that culturally that is not the case for many. I know in my family background, my grandfather was in charge and he did everything, and my grandma didn't know anything about the finances. And my dad passed that, my grandpa passed that same way of thinking along to his son, my dad. Never been healthy, never a good thing, not ideal.
Yeah, if one person is spending money and the other person's not comfortable with the way it's being spent, there's a serious problem in the marriage, and you need to be on the same page. And oftentimes there are other deeper underlying issues going on. But money, you make decisions together and you decide. You know, like we decide, let's say our budget, I don't know, $800 a month for food. Well, then within that $800 budget, I can buy whatever food I think the family needs. But any kind of, we decide on what we spend and then we stick to that because that shows trust. You have to have true love and true unity and partnership in marriage, there needs to be trust. Without trust, everything else breaks down. And so you need to be able to come together and make a decision about your finances together and to trust that the other person is not going to betray your decisions as a unit, because it's a unit. And so what you do affects me and what I do affects you, and you're not an island anymore. So I don't know, I hope that answers your question, but it's an important thing.
Anyone else before we close with prayer? Yes.
Was it me?
I didn't see any other hand.
No, I know
There's
you-
one behind you, but
No, I do also have a question.
okay.
Thank you, Elder. Thank you very much. I know there are a lot of conflict between couples in terms of how to deal with day-to-day situation within the house, whether the husband has to help with the cleaning, thing like that. Sometimes the wife is tired, just want to take a rest, and want the husband to be in the kitchen, thing like that, even cooking. For you, being a couple who come from, two different cultures, how you deal with things like that.
Great question.
And the second question that I have is a question about intimacy, how to approach each other. I know some ladies, they don't care about being naked in the house sometimes, or the husband, and sometimes, either of you would not like to be naked because, you may not want the other one to see your whole body and things like that. You are two different cultures. How you deal with that situation either.
We'll start with the first one. That'll take an hour, then the second one will take another hour. So on the first one, there's nothing biblical about gender being a determining factor as to who cleans, cooks, and does things around the house versus, outside the house. I think in general, if the arrangement is that I'm working full-time and she's home full-time, then she's going to carry the majority of the load. That's kind of how we agreed during that season of life. Once she starts working full-time, and she has worked full-time, then we adjust, because if you think about it, if he works full-time and she works full-time, and they're both working full-time outside the home, then is it fair that the woman bears the majority of the burdens of caring for all of the things that need to be cared for in the house, laundry, cleaning, cooking, etc.? I think a lot of times we assume it's the woman's job because of culture, not because of biblical values. So I don't think there's anything wrong with a man learning how, and I had to learn. I didn't really learn how to cook, clean growing up very much, although maybe more than the average Brazilian boy, because I was raised here in the United States by my mom, and started teaching me a few things around the house. So I wasn't completely crippled when I got married, but still relatively crippled. And I have learned that in general, it's not really fair because women do work outside the home nowadays, and they're still, in most cases, bearing the majority of the burdens. So I think the biblical principle is fairness. And I think we need to, as a team, come together and say, okay, what are some things, how can we divide based on gifts and just based on things need to get done, and how can we make this sustainable for both of us?
Yeah, and then taking into account your preferences. So like Diego will sometimes say, you know, do you want me to do the groceries? And you know what? I love doing the groceries. Like, I have such pleasure in buying food. And so I was like, no, that's not something I want off my plate. But if you can clean the toilet tonight, that would be great. But what I have found in our marriage that helped me, and I think for a lot of women this might be the case. So, you know, as the kids have gotten older and I've worked more, he has carried more weight around the house. Whereas before, when I was home with the kids, I would do more around the house. But I still have to remember that his way of doing things is going to be different than my way. Just we talk about keeping each other's individuality. So like if he's in the kitchen, the truth be known, I don't want to see it. Like I don't want to see him working in the kitchen because he does things different than I would. And I want to be like, no, not that knife. This is the knife you take for the potatoes. But if you're peeling the apple, you use, and you know, there's room for me to teach him some things, but I also have to let him do his thing his way. And bathrooms, I'll be like, the bathroom's disgusting. You need to clean it. He's like, I didn't think it would look dirty, you know? And so in that sense, we have to give each other room, because if I expect him to be me, that is not fair on his part. So he's going to help me around the house his way with his skill, and I can't criticize that. I have to be grateful. And I'll never forget this one story. We have these friends in Brazil. They weren't even married yet. And the wife asked the soon-to-be husband to go to the grocery store and buy food. And she wanted him to buy, I think it was onions. Among the things she wanted to buy were onions. And he went to the store and he bought onions, and he brought home these onions, and they were big onions. And he thought, you know, these big, beautiful onions. And his soon-to-be wife was like, sweetie, you should not have bought the big onions, because sometimes I only need a little bit of onion, and I need to cut an onion. I have this onion that's open. If I had a little onion, the man never bought groceries for his wife again. And because she criticized his way of doing it. And so I do think we need to help each other, but I need to let him do it his way and, you know, gently make some suggestions as I feel necessary for some things. But I think that's just my observation.
On the second question on intimacy, I think that couples need to come to a place where they can have conversations. It's one of the most uncomfortable conversations I think that husbands and wives can have as to what your preferences are. You know, you talk about walking around the house naked. In some cultures and in some families, that's perfectly acceptable. I know growing up, my mother was that way, and no big deal. It's just the culture, that's the way it was. But if I marry into a culture where that is a big deal, and no, we need to be a little more modest, even around each other, unless it's the moment for intimacy, then I need to adjust to what is preferable. It just so happens that for us, we didn't really have to make too many adjustments. My family background and your family background was very much the same, and we're a little more, I think, casual around each other when it comes to whether it's being naked around each other or even going to the bathroom around each other. No big deal. I know that my sister, I hope this is not being live streamed, is it?
It is.
You know, it's like, it's so taboo. She's been married to her husband for many years, but, you know, they're like, they would never think about going to the bathroom in front of each other. They've been married, you know, but no, it's a no-no. But those are things that just need to be talked about. I'm not going to give you a biblical answer here. There's nothing in the Bible that says how you should or shouldn't, be around each other.
But it's a reflection of the general communication of your marriage is reflected in your intimate life.
That's right. That's right. It's very uncomfortable to talk about it, but if there's something that bothers you, you have to be able to tell your wife and vice versa. Don't live with it for 50 years and then resent it. If I burp at the table and she doesn't like it, she needs to be able to tell me. And she licks her fingers and I don't like it, I need to be able to tell her. And it doesn't mean that she can't still lick her fingers and I can't burp, but at least you got it off your chest. And if it bothers you enough that this is going to be a deal breaker, then maybe you do need to talk about it, get some therapy, whatever. The other one needs to concede, whatever. But yes, I hope that answers your question. At the end of the day, you just got to be able to talk about it because there's no right or wrong. Yes.
Hello, another question along the lines of maybe infidelity and things like that. In today's society, it's hard to hide it because, electronic devices and people, gender neutral, all these different things that's going on. So how would you, so you have spouses that stay together even though infidelities happen. How would you suggest that they express themselves, especially the one that's probably offended and the other one is like, get over it, or, something to that effect?
So there are some behaviors that are non-negotiable. So my mother divorced my dad when I was 6, and there was behavior that was actually unacceptable. I don't think she should have waited that long, but she did what she thought was right, trying to make it work, but 6 years was too much. She has a high tolerance for pain. So some behavior is unacceptable. And forgiveness is always the right thing, but forgiveness is not reconciliation. Forgiveness is not trust. Forgiveness is not putting up with unacceptable behavior. So there are a number of things that are unacceptable. A man addicted to pornography and not feeling like there's anything wrong with it, that's unacceptable. It's unsustainable for a marriage.
I would say it's a red flag if someone's saying, get over it.
Yeah, a woman sleeping around, that's unsustainable. It brings risks. He can get sexually transmitted diseases. There's so many reasons why certain sexual sins are intolerable. And I believe it's not just sexual sins, it's also abuse. Now, is there the possibility for a marriage to be healed and restored? Absolutely. But that does not depend on the offended. It depends on the offender. And if there is absolutely no legitimate reasons to believe that there is the potential for change in the behavior, then forgiveness is always on the table, but that means I forgive you, bye. Not I forgive you and let's try again. Because forgiveness, true biblical forgiveness, sometimes means it's over and I forgive you. So those two are not mutually exclusive. It's a really tough conversation, and we didn't really get a chance to get too much into it in this seminar. We do have, part 5 is about forgiveness and reconciliation, and essentially what we teach is that forgiveness and reconciliation are two very different things, and they are not always possible. One is possible, forgiveness. The second one depends on the offended actually having, the offender actually changing. Yes.
I just had one quick, I know time is running out. I was wondering if you would touch the area of the whole family being not just a couple, parents, in-laws, extended family, and their involvement.
Yes.
And especially when they age, your involvement in their care and so on and so forth.
Wow.
That's too big a subject.
Before we get into the aging, one thing that we do find is important, we've been talking about communication, right? High context, low context communication. And so when you marry, so when I married Diego, for example, and I was interacting with his family, he's gonna help me to make sure that I have high context communication with his family. He's gonna become my interpreter. So he's gonna make sure that when I'm talking to his aunt, his grandpa, his mom, that he's gonna observe and he's going to help me navigate the differences. And I'm gonna do the same with my family. And I say this, I think it's really important because as a couple, you need to be united, and I've seen these things where there's these cultural differences or whatever differences, and then the family starts resenting the spouse, but really what it is it's just miscommunication again. But this is, the spouse is responsible for making sure that I'm communicating properly with his family and vice versa.
Let me illustrate, and then you can get to the second half of this question. My aunt, she's Brazilian. She's coming to visit us from Boston. She's flown all day. She arrives in Oregon. She's tired. She's hungry. She arrives at the house, and Melissa says, "Hey, welcome. Would you like some food?" And she says, "No, thank you." From the French-Canadian background, that means no thank you. From the Brazilian background, that means yes, but you need to ask one more time before I can say okay. So I have to come to Melissa and say, ask again. And sometimes she has to ask 3 times to insist, and then she'll say, okay, you know what I mean?
And
So
if he
that's
didn't do that, his aunt would be offended.
Yes.
And then his aunt would be like, who's this stupid person he married? You know, I'm just being honest.
Yeah.
These things happen.
Yeah.
Like, I can't believe you married a person that's this way. Well, no, it's communication gaps between the cultures, but he's supposed to be my interpreter. He's
Yeah.
supposed to help me bridge that gap.
Yeah. So I am the interpreter. So when we're having a meal and there's one piece of, gluten left on the table, and Melissa says, would anybody like it? And she's there and she's not going to take it. I say, Melissa, just put it on her plate. That's interpretation.
Yeah. So that I just wanted to make that point because I think that's important because these things can also erode marriages. Regarding taking care of your parents, like, this is just totally opinions, and yet we're not there yet with our parents, so maybe when the time and place comes, our opinions will change, but so it's a fine line, right? Because, like, I have my father, he's retired, and there's a lot of things I wish I could help him with, but he's not my son, he's my father. So I'm not making decisions for him. He's making all sorts of decisions that are affecting him. I'd love to help him and everything, but like at the end of the day, he's an adult and he's making decisions. And to what extent do I later have to change my whole life because of his decisions? I want to help him and I want to be there for him. But I also have a life and I can't just, this is going on actually in Diego's family right now, where Diego's grandmother has Alzheimer's. And Diego's aunt, her family, she's doing everything to help her mom. But early on, we knew this, we saw this coming, and we're like, if you do this now, it's going to be so much easier later. But they refused to. They let the mom make her own decisions till she could no longer. And so now the aunt, I don't know what, like, it's not sustainable what she's doing. She's not working enough. She's gonna, when she retires, she's not gonna have enough money because she's spending all this time helping her mother. And so you need to.
Here it is. You help your aging parents on your terms, not the terms of the aging parents. Very simple. I live in Georgia. I'm going to be there for my mom, but I'm not going to move to Arizona to be there for my mom. She's going to move to Georgia. That's just one example of and thankfully Melissa and I agree on this, because if we didn't, then we would have to navigate this and figure out how, but we are at 100% agreement on this particular issue. We believe we have a responsibility to our parents.
We would do everything to keep our parents out of a nursing home. Like,
We
I don't want to
help
put
them
our
on
parents.
our terms, not on their terms. In other words, you know, some people, as they age, they want to stay in their place. They don't want to move from their house. They don't want to change their routine. And so then you have two options. Either you're going to move and adjust your whole life in order for them to keep their routine, or they're going to have to move and adjust their routine to adjust to yours. And I just think that, the way Melissa and I are reasoning is the way we hope we would want our kids to do for us. We don't want to change our kids when they're older and they have their families, for them to have to change their whole lives and routines in order to accommodate us. And so as we get older, we need to think about our kids and say, okay, how can we make it easy on our kids? And so hopefully we're not going to be in debt, and we're not going to be needing money from them and all of this. And so I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's such a tough one.
It's a hard one. My grandmother set a beautiful example. So my grandmother, as she was aging, she started getting rid of her own stuff. She's like, I don't want to have all these things that my kids have to go through. And she was thinking, she's like, I don't want to be a burden. So she really thought through, what is me aging going to look like? How can I make it easy for my children to take care of me? And that went pretty well.
Beautiful.
And I have another friend who's doing the same thing, Valerie Barr, and she's like, I want to think about what does it mean for my family to take care of me, and I want them to take care of me, but what are the steps that I can do? So, when you're all thinking of each other and not just of yourselves, then again, it can be beautiful, but it's really hard.
I think the principle is, as a couple, we have to be in agreement that we're going to help our family within our ability on our terms, not their terms. And I think the husband and wife need to agree on that. Our terms, not their terms. And that may be a disappointment to some members of the family. And as a couple, so here's where Melissa and I are. We prioritize each other over any other family member. That's what the Bible teaches. Leave and cleave. That's a Genesis 2 clear principle. We still care for our families, but the highest priority, second to God, is each other. Leave and cleave. So Melissa is more important than my mom. That does not violate the fifth commandment. I'm more important than her dad to her. That's not a violation. But we still have a responsibility to our parents, but it's on our terms. And that still means we're going to be generous and give of our time and our resources, but it's going to be within reason. In other words, we're not going to sacrifice the kids' college so that my mom or dad or, her mom or dad are now going to be able to stay in the house they've lived in all their lives so that we can go there and that's just not going to happen. And I'm not criticizing those that do that, but that's where we have landed on that. Okay, what a sad note to end on. Do we have a more positive note to end on?
Yes, prayer.
Okay, he's going to end us on a positive note.
Fiji, just listening to the story about your Brazil friend that went to buy onion, it reminds me 5 years ago my wife wanted to learn how to drive. So I said, let's do it. I'm tired of driving. So first day, second day, third day, she seems to be confident. Okay. So I told her, once you get onto the stop sign, turn left. When we reached the stop sign, she turned right. And I asked her, why didn't you turn left? She said, because I want to turn right. That 5 years till today, I never wanted to teach her how to drive again. So the same as buying the onion. It's just against each other.
Yes.
She goes her way thinking, I'm comfortable now, I can do my own.
Yeah.
But she's still learning.
Yeah.
So I don't know what, but I just said, no, you have to stop right there until today.
Yes. Melissa, why don't you pray for us, and we're going to
Okay.
let's bow our heads and we'll dismiss.
Dear kind Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for the beautiful gift of marriage. And we know that by your grace, home can be a little piece of heaven on earth. And if each home was a little piece of heaven, and together we could come together and have churches that are little pieces of heaven on earth that could attract all the sick and sorrowing in this world and just bring them to you. And that's our greatest desire. So help us, Lord, to learn to put self aside and learn to really love others the way that you loved, showing them your love, learning to understand them, where they come from, and just being like Christ. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you guys for joining us this afternoon.
I just want to say thank you for Melissa and Pastor Diego for coming from Tennessee and encouraging our spiritual life, and enriching our understanding of married life, family life, our relationship with the aged, and also the children. Thank you so much for coming. And sometime in the future, we'll meet again. Okay. Thank you for the afternoon, everyone. See you next Sabbath.